All right, what is the concept of crowd out in economics? And there's going to be a couple of different types of crowd out that I'm going to go over. The classic one is crowd out of private markets by government programs. And of course, because I teach behavioral economics, there's also crowd out of intrinsic incentives by extrinsic incentives. So there's always a crowd out of one thing by another thing, but usually the person using this term doesn't specify what these are. They just sort of expect the person listening to intuit what they're talking about. So let me just give the setup. The basic idea, and let me start out with crowd out of private labor markets. The crowd out of private labor markets by government use of labor looks like this. It's basically you're going along and you have the government that's hiring a certain number of people to build roads and teach in the schools. And then you have private markets where people are, working for private schools and working for shops and working as haircutters and all that sort of stuff. And if the government decides to expand its scope, like to hire more people to do government hired stuff, then that's actually going to crowd out the private market because they have to hire from the same pool of employment labor. So there's only room for a certain amount of people to be employed. If the government gets bigger, it inherently makes the private labor market smaller. And let me represent that on the diagram. So the government expansion of its industry inherently has to shrink the private industry, the private sector of jobs. Now, this does not have to be one-to-one. So you notice on the diagram, there's spaces out here where the government is expanding that are not eating into the private labor market. And the private labor market, same there, that there's spaces that are responding to that are not necessarily directly taken over by the government. So it does not have to be one-to-one, but it does get at the idea that there is some sort of scarce resource, and that scarce resource, these two groups are competing for that scarce resource. Now, another government-based example would be the example of insurance markets. So here we might have the government expanding health insurance coverage, and this could be that they're expanding the qualifications for, say, Medicaid. Like, if you have to have under $20,000 a year to qualify for Medicaid. Now, Medicaid rules are way more complicated than that, but let's say they expand it by saying actually everyone who makes under $30,000 a year can now qualify for Medicaid. Well, some of the people who were previously buying insurance on the private market, they're going to switch over to the government insurance, and that's going to sort of crowd out the private market for health insurance. Now, what about crowd out of intrinsic incentives by extrinsic incentives? An example here might be if you have a neighborhood of people where some of the preteens and teenagers are babysitting just out of the good of their heart for other people in the neighborhood, because that's sort of an expectation. It's a social expectation. They want the experience so that they can have job experience for their resume, whatever. They're doing the babysitting sort of from intrinsic incentives. Like they want to, help people. They're, going along with social incentives in the neighborhood. If you start to pay some of the teenagers in that neighborhood, other teenagers in the neighborhood might say, I'm not going to work for free. This is a financial thing now. It's this money exchange. So by introducing a financial payoff, you could actually crowd out the intrinsic incentives that were getting people to babysit for free before. And this actually relates to the classic example here. The classic example is that there were a set of daycares that got really frustrated with parents showing up late to pick up their kids. So, obviously that's hard on the workers who want to get home to their families. So they implemented a fine. Like if you show up late, you have to pay a certain amount. And the problem was after they implemented the fine, more people showed up late. Like it was more common once the fine showed up for people to show up late. Because then previously you had like the guilt factor, like the fact that, oh, I feel really guilty for making this person stay late by coming being late to pick up my kids, and that guilt was an intrinsic incentive. And when you introduce the financial incentives, the payoff parents were thinking about is, oh, I just have to pay another extra like $20 to show up late. That's less of an incentive than the guilt was. So you had this crowd out of intrinsic incentives by oftentimes financial incentives. People's motivations are oftentimes going to be some combination of intrinsic and extrinsic. And if the extrinsic motivations get bigger because there's these new systems that are sort of making those extrinsic incentives bigger, then oftentimes the intrinsic part of people's motivation shrinks or becomes less salient to them. So this is just the concept of crowd out in economics.